Last week, we started off our look at the book of Daniel, a fantastic little book. And this week, we're going to keep continuing on. If you missed last week, Jerusalem had fallen. Babylon had come, and over a series of 3 assaults, if you will, they had more or less leveled Jerusalem. But on the first assault, they took some of the treasures out of Jerusalem. And these treasures included gold, but it also included people. And some of the people that they took out were 3 young men that we ran into. You might know them as Shadrach and Benny, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. And this week we're going to pick up by continuing on in chapter 1, verse 8. So if you would, turn your Bibles to chapter 1, verse 8, or you can follow along on the screen. Daniel has landed in the palace of the king of Babylon. He would be trained to be an advisor, to be somebody that the king could show off and somebody that might help the king in advisement. The king would collect the best and the brightest from the nations that he conquered. He would kind of put them together, and then he would educate them and train them and assimilate them into his culture, and then they would sort of be advisors, counselors, and maybe somewhat showpieces of nations that he had conquered. Daniel and his friends are beginning this 3-year journey of enculturation into the land of Babylon and its nation. And this is where we pick up our text in verse 8. It says, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." These young men, they would have been fairly young. We don't know exactly, but probably teenagers, 16, 17, 18, somewhere in that range. Daniel took a look around and saw what was happening. He saw that they were in a pretty difficult spot. Now, you might not expect that because they're in the king's palace. The king's palace would have been well provided with food, protection. They would have had the king's hand guarding them from maltreatment. So why was Daniel in such a difficult spot? Their God was punishing their nation. Yahweh had delivered Israel. And now Daniel and his friends were in the land that they were to be stuck the rest of their lives. Last week, as we looked at the introduction to the book of Daniel, we saw that God's punishment was on the nation of Israel at this time, and curses that were laid out for them in Sinai. If Israel rebelled against God, they were being delivered as promised. So Daniel would have known all of this in the background. For generations, the southern nation of Judah was testing God and testing his limits. And now the time for the covenant was called in. Daniel and his friends were just showing up to the scene, too. They were kind of dropped right into the middle of a terrible situation. They didn't cause it, they couldn't fix it, and they couldn't escape it. They had to figure out how to live with it. And as Daniel looked around, he could see all the pressures mounting on his people to be assimilated into the Babylonian culture. He was being raised in their courts. He was being educated in their literature. He was learning their languages and their customs. He was learning their food rituals and how to interact in polite society. They even changed the names of these young men, the names of his friends. And the way they changed them was to take their reference to their old religious beliefs in God and rename them names that would have called on names of Babylonian culture. So they named them after foreign gods. Daniel and his friends, they were in danger. They were in danger of being consumed into their new cultures. And decades later, when the Jews were permitted to leave Palestine, the number that returned was barely a fraction of those that were taken into Babylon. The vast majority of Jews that were taken were assimilated into the country. But not Daniel. Daniel saw what was happening, and he decided that he had to honor God and do the best he could to stay true to God no matter what. One area that Daniel saw that he could control some was in the food that he was eating. So he approached the man that was in charge and asked for his blessing to alter his diet to conform with his customs and his convictions. That's a pretty bold ask. You're intentionally resisting the process of assimilation. You're risking being singled out when that could easily lead you to a good deal of trouble. Not only that, his request could put his supervisors in trouble too. Last week we said that even in the exile, even when it seemed like God had abandoned his people, God hadn't finished writing Israel's story. In 600 years from this time, Jesus would be born. And he would descend from the people who were now exiled in Babylon. The story wasn't over, and God is still active even in bleak and seemingly hopeless situations. But Daniel couldn't have seen that yet. Daniel had a choice in his moment to choose to honor God or to not. And Daniel sought to honor God. And God's hand guided and guarded Daniel in return. In verse 9, we continue. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. It's a big piece right there, to find favor in someone's sight. Daniel stepped out in faith. He risked his neck, and possibly the necks of his friends. But God rewarded his faithfulness. Did Daniel know how everything would work out later in his life from the way he approached this issue? No. No, that's why it took courage. Real courage. God granted Daniel compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. It wasn't as simple as just compassion, though. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. The guy in charge, he was just fulfilling his duty as well as he knew how. He was in charge with making these young people suitable for the king's palace. And if that didn't happen, if he failed in some way to take care of these guys, it was probably going to end with his death. There was a real good chance that he would be killed for mismanaging what the king gave him to manage. Don't forget, as accommodating as the king of Babylon was to foreign peoples, he was still a violent and a bit of a capricious man. Many people would lose their lives to his whim. That is one of the drawbacks of living in that kind of a society. Daniel's request didn't only put himself in danger, they put his supervisors in danger as well. And Daniel's response, even at this young age, shows a wisdom beyond most people many years his senior. Listen to what he says. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Daniel, in this very difficult moment, found a win-win situation with his supervisor. So he listened to him in this matter and tested them for 10 days. Daniel recognized the situation that his superior was in. And as much as he was caught up in a bigger system than just what Daniel was experiencing. The person in charge of him had little power to change anything real big. And his neck was on the line just as much as Daniel's was. Instead of dumping all of Daniel's frustration and angst into the closest authority figure, he saw the humanity of this situation, of this chief. Maybe if his superior would just allow a trial period, they could test it out without putting his life at risk. Daniel couldn't have known how this was going to work out, but he thought he had to take a chance. He had to do something. He was determined not to defile himself. And that was Daniel's primary purpose, to not defile himself, to not be assimilated completely into Babylon, to not give up his identity. So how in the world are vegetables going to do this, right? A surprising amount of attention has been given to this passage as a kind of template for healthy eating. And while I think people that are trying to eat healthy is actually a pretty good thing, I don't think our passage here is trying to give any dietary advice. It shows how a young man was trying to honor the Mosaic food laws in a foreign country. Food laws that really don't apply to you and me as Christians today. But these youths would have been fed the very best of the king's food in an effort to make them as fitting for the palace service as possible. And this would have likely involved all kinds of foods that were prepared improperly according to Jewish law. It would have also been mixed with many meats and foods that were forbidden by Jews, or for Jews. On top of that, it's possible that a lot of the meat came from pagan rituals. Meat, per se, isn't the problem here, but something about the process and the sources of the food and the meat was putting Daniel in a position where it would violate his following God's law. A covenant God made with Israel as they left Egypt and were on their way to Palestine. Food laws that God gave them largely to prevent them from assimilating into the cultures that they were supposed to abstain from around them in Palestine. So Daniel was just looking for anything that he could do to hold on to the kosher laws that God had given them. And that didn't leave a lot of options. And there were so many things outside of Daniel's control. But this was something that maybe something he could control. His request was not made by somebody that was a dietary expert and knew about good and bad cholesterols. His request was made by a teenager trying to honor God and hold on to his Jewish identity in an onslaught of Babylonian assimilation. He asked to eat what is often translated here as vegetables, but as you dig into the word a bit more, it can include that. It's actually a much broader term that is used more generally that refers to seeds and grains used to feed animals or fodder and for planting. In neither Akkadian nor Hebrew is it ever used to describe human food. So basically, Daniel is just asking for some of the raw ingredients that he could prepare himself for him and his friends. And he could keep it out of the king's kitchen. He could keep it out of these various ways that it could violate the Mosaic law. The food wasn't prepared in improper ways. It was a way to avoid contamination, religious contamination. And there were still many things that Daniel couldn't do, but this was something he could do. So he did it. And can you imagine the significant downgrade in the quality of food that he must have sort of taken on to himself and for his friends? You can have the best of the king's everything, Or you can have sort of grain that's not even described as human food, that you can mush up and boil in water and make into oatmeal. I don't know, I hate oatmeal. If I wanted pre-chewed food, I'd get baby food or ask my kids for help. But oatmeal day after day after day, or however, I'm sure he got creative, but it's just basic, right? It's flavorless, it's just nourishment at that point. It's gruel. And you know what? It worked. And God granted them the success in their endeavor. Daniel 15 through 16 reads this. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were in better appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youth who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wines they were to drink and gave them this food, this vegetables. The text is not aimed at impressing us with Daniel's dietary knowledge, though. He's just a kid. He's a kid trying to honor God in an impossible situation. We are meant to, though, be impressed by his courage, by his wisdom, by his determination to be faithful to God, and God's gracious provision and response to Daniel's faithfulness. Daniel sought to honor God, and he found a way to do it in this incredibly difficult situation. His courage, his creativity, his respect for God, and his trust in him, it got God's attention. And God came to his rescue. And God helped them. Listen to the next parts of the text. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had an understanding in all visions and dreams. Interpreting visions and dreams, it was a big deal in Babylon at the time. Many of those people believed that the gods would communicate to them through their dreams, and various religious cults had many dream interpreters and methods for discerning the will and communications of their various gods. So this collection of youths, that would have been an important thing for the king of Babylon. But the true God gave Daniel a special gift for interpreting his dreams and visions. God gave Daniel gifts that would grant them influence in their context. And it worked. And at the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none of them were found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. Daniel didn't just risk his cushy situation, his life of leisure and fancy food. He also risked his life by trying to figure out how to remain faithful to God. Daniel and his friends, they stood out. But they stood out to different people for different reasons. Daniel stood out to the chief eunuch. The chief eunuch had compassion on him, on this young man, a man that showed great wisdom and creativity in finding this win-win situation that might ease the dangers for both parties. And God granted that compassion. Daniel stood out to his friends, and his friends stood out to the king because they had more wisdom than all the other guys around them. I mean, these are the best and brightest from all the nations this king has conquered, and they're gathering together. And these 4 guys from this one nation are just markedly better than everybody else. They're smarter. They're wise. They're more helpful. The king likely didn't know this whole food situation when he was interviewing them. I'm sure that probably didn't come up. But he could tell there was something different about these guys, and that they were just better at helping him. But more than anything, Daniel and his friends stood out to God. The eunuch saw respectful young men, and he had compassion on them. Young men torn out of their country and by themselves in an unfamiliar place. The king saw great intelligence, great wisdom. Both of them saw what they saw because of what God saw. And God didn't particularly fancy their wisdom or their intelligence, their good looks or their natural talent. God saw their character, their faithfulness. What ultimately makes Daniel and his friends stand out is not smarts, it's not looks. It was their character and their determination to be faithful to God no matter what. There was a lot of smart and good-looking youths in the king's court. I'm sure that's all the king would permit. But that's not what set Daniel apart. Daniel and his friends stood out because of character. And because of their character, God granted them even more intelligence and wisdom. Daniel was off to a very difficult but really great start. He was in a program intended for assimilating him. And he was able to find a way not only to resist being assimilated, but God also proved the standing of Daniel and his friends, and they would be excellent representatives of God's people in a foreign land. I think it's pretty well recognized that our culture here in America, it's not becoming more sympathetic to Christian views and practices. The majority of people in the US, of course, still claim Christianity for themselves. And there's more to say about that. But in general, they at least see it as a generally positive thing. But times are changing. And increasingly in the workplace, in the marketplace, in our places of education, it's becoming more popular to be dismissive, if not even defiant, of God. And we truly don't know what tomorrow brings. But even today, many people are experiencing the pressures of assimilation into the new worldviews of our society. Worldviews that are taking aim at Christians' views of gender and sexuality, views that want to make Jesus one of many spiritually enlightened wise guys or someone who's nice but optional. Philosophies that have no place for the word sin, because that word implies a transcendent moral lawgiver that will hold us all accountable for our actions, and so much more. Our situation here, though, it's not unique. Thousands and thousands of years, Christians in all places have always had this challenge, always resisting becoming assimilated into their various Babylons. And here, in our text, we have an example of someone who did it well. Daniel did a great job. And there's a few things that we can learn from Daniel in this text. The food laws that Daniel was trying to observe, they've long passed away with the Old Covenant. And in the New Covenant, our faithfulness to God, it isn't related to clean and unclean food anymore. But that's hardly the point, isn't it? The pressure to assimilate into our cultures will come from any number of places and any number of times. Determine that you will not defile yourself. Daniel's first response, before all of the rest of this text, was he determined not to be defiled. His first response was not to be changed by everyone else. He would stick with God, come what may. You won't resist being conformed to this world unless you determine not to. You have to make the decision for yourself, and not for anyone else, on who your life is going to honor, or what you are going to do, and for whom. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself. There were a lot of things he couldn't control, and a lot of the assimilation would have not defiled him necessarily. He wore their clothes. He spoke their languages. He learned their history and their customs. Daniel had to discern between what battles to pick. And a lot of the battles would have just been him shaking his fist at them. Daniel accommodated a lot of adaptation, but he drew the line on what would defile him before God. I think that's a pretty good place for us to start. If you're being asked to do something that will defile you before God, that's a big red flag and a good place to plant a fence post. Because if you compromise your relationship with God, it doesn't matter what you gain for it. It's not worth it. Determine at work or at school, at home, online, with friends, determine not to consent to anything that will defile you. And remember, what other people do to you may feel defiling, but they can't separate you from God, no matter what they do. Only our own free choices can divide us from God. Determine to not be defiled. Second is to determine to be respectful. Once you've determined not to defile yourself, your next determination is to be a respectful person. Daniel's appeal was not a grandstand or a kind of revolutionary defiance. He simply and humbly wanted to avoid defiling himself before God. Daniel sought a compromise that was not compromising. He sought a way to work out with those who either saw the world differently, were under their own authority or difficult circumstance, and they were just trying to keep themselves out of trouble. He saw a way to figure out how to work together with them. The chief of the eunuchs, he wasn't the king. And the king would kill this chief if he didn't carry out his duties well. Daniel was understanding and tried to find a win-win. There are times that you cannot find a win-win. And we're going to see a few of those in our text as we go further. But we tend to jump straight to the no-win situation in our minds. Maybe before we go there, like Daniel, we try to find another way. A way that allows us not to defile ourselves and those around us to not unnecessarily suffer because of our piety. Determined to be respectful. And finally, determined to trust God, no matter what. The story really could have gone another way. And Daniel was prepared for it too. Daniel gave up what was easy and better for what was more pleasing to God. He had the nation's best chefs and food being hand-delivered to him daily. Instead, he chose to eat gruel that he had to prepare himself for a long time. Very possible it took 3 years of doing this before he was presented to the king. It's a long time to be faithful without seeing any rewards. But Daniel decided to stick with God and to trust him no matter what. And God looked favorably upon Daniel. And then he worked in wondrous ways with and for these 4 young men. Whatever would happen would happen. But Daniel and his friends didn't want anything to happen to their relationship with God. Because if they had that, anything else could happen and it would be okay. And it wasn't their intelligence. It wasn't their rugged good looks. It wasn't their charisma that made them stand head and shoulders above everybody else. In fact, even though they were probably most of those things, they were just average now in the king's court. God didn't pick them because they were smart. God didn't pick them because they were attractive or any other superficial factors. It was their character that set them apart. You and I, we don't get to pick our IQs, our bodies for the most part, or even to some degree our personalities. But we do get to pick our character. And the world is in desperate need of men and women of character. So, as you walk out your faith in your lives this week, determine not to be defiled, determine to be respectful, and determine to trust God with the outcomes, no matter what. Let's pray.